Hey, Faith Family, my name is Ryan. I'm one of the pastors here, and I get the privilege of introducing the next book in our Bible reading plan, and that is the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is the fourth book of the Bible, and it is part of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses is the source and author of the Pentateuch, which means he is the source and author of the book of Numbers. Now let's talk a little bit about the title Numbers. Why Numbers? Now Numbers is the English title, and it actually comes from 2 censuses that are taken in the book of Numbers. The first one in chapter 1, and then there's a second census taken in chapter 26. The first census is taken of the first generation of the people of Israel, the ones who first escaped out of slavery. And that's the first census. Over in 26, there's another census taken, and that is of the second generation, the children of the first generation, and they are counted, they are numbered there. Now, the Hebrew title is actually in the wilderness, which is perhaps an even more accurate description of the book's content. You'll see why. Let me give you a brief overview of the book. The book of Numbers carries forward the story of the people of God after their exodus from slavery. It is the story of Israel's journey through the desert on their way to the promised land, the land that God had promised them. You've heard it called the land of Canaan, a journey that should have only taken a couple of weeks if you look at it on the map. A couple of weeks by foot, they should be there. No worries, right? Well, the journey ended up taking them almost 40 years. Why? Why did it take 40 years to do what should have taken 2 weeks? Well, you'll see as you read the book. The book begins at Mount Sinai. God had brought them to Mount Sinai, and he had entered into a covenant with them. His presence is with them, and he is going to lead them to the promised land. And so in chapter 1 through 10, chapter 10 of the book, you see them preparing, getting organized for the journey. And then in chapter 10, they begin the journey to the promised land. At first, everything's great. God is leading them. He is guiding them. But it isn't long before the complaining starts. You've been on those trips, right? Are we there yet? When are we going to get there? I'm hungry. All of these things. They begin to complain, and the complaining starts. And then they begin to grumble, and they grumble and complain. And at one point, they refuse to go forward, and they begin to be disobedient to the God who loves them. They don't trust God, and they actually want to go back. They're wanting to go back, and they choose to disobey God. We see in the book, because of their disobedience, God's judgment comes to that first generation, and they will not be able to enter the promised land. And so they spend 40 years wandering in the desert, where eventually they die in the desert. But here's the deal. God is always faithful to keep his promises. And so as you get to the end of the book ends with the people of God on the plains of Moab, just across the Jordan River from the promised land. And the new generation, the children of the first generation, are now preparing to go into the promised land. They are leaving the old generation behind, including Moses, because they were disobedient. They were under God's judgment. They could not enter the promised land, and they are preparing to go. And we are left at the end of the book wondering, are they going to trust God or be disobedient like the generation before them? There's a brief overview of the book. Now, there are a couple of themes that you'll see in the book that are very evident. First is the judgment of God. You see it throughout, over and over. The people complain, God is gracious, but his judgment comes to them. Judgment and consequences come to the people of God because of their disobedience. But you also see over and over the grace and the faithfulness of God. God doesn't abandon his people even in their rebellion. The book of Numbers is a great book. So let's dive into the book of Numbers. And as we do, my prayer is that we will learn, we will grow, and we will encounter the living God through his word.